My wife told me she felt disgusted every time we slept together and said we were better off as friends, so I stopped acting like her husband. She completely lost it. The sentence that ended my marriage wasn't, "I want a divorce." It was much crueler. My wife looked me in the eyes after 9 years together and admitted she felt disgusted every time we were intimate. Then she added that she loved me, just not as a husband. As a best friend. Roommate. Someone safe. But not someone she desired. Honestly wished she had simply admitted she was cheating. Somehow would have hurt less. My wife, Claire, and I had been together for 12 years. Married for 9. No children. Good careers. Comfortable home. From the outside, we looked like the couple everyone expected to stay together forever. Inside our house, and things had quietly been falling apart for years. At first, it was little things. Then she stopped holding my hand. Then stopped kissing me goodbye before work. Then stopped sitting next to me on the couch. Then our bedroom slowly became colder. Once a week became once a month. Once a month became every few months. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, she always blamed stress. New work. And fatigue. Hormones. Believed her. And because that's what husbands are supposed to do. And support. And be patient. Not pressure their wives. And so I waited. And months became years. Planned vacations. And surprise dates. And weekend trips. And anything classes. And anything that might help us reconnect. And sometimes things improved for a week. And then everything slipped right back. None Friday evening, I finally asked whether she still loved me. Nan she sighed. Not angrily. Almost tired. Then she admitted she'd been avoiding the conversation because she didn't want to hurt me. Then she finally said it. Then she no longer saw me romantically. Then she said I felt more like family. Not like a brother. And a best friend. Then she even admitted that whenever we were intimate, she forced herself through it because she knew I wanted to feel close to her. Then came the sentence that still echoes in my head. She confessed that afterward, she often felt disgusted with herself, not because of anything I'd done, just because the intimacy felt wrong to her. I didn't speak for several minutes. I genuinely couldn't process what I'd heard. 9 years of marriage, and my wife was describing sleeping with me as though it were some unpleasant obligation. I quietly asked why she hadn't simply told me earlier. She started crying. She claimed she'd hoped the feelings would return someday. They never did. Then she said something even stranger. She insisted she didn't want to divorce. She wanted us to stay exactly as we were. She said emotional connection mattered more than physical attraction. She believed mature couples eventually became companions instead of lovers. She said we had something rare. A friendship. A partnership. She didn't want to lose that. I listened carefully. Then I asked one simple question. If a handsome coworker flirted with her tomorrow, would she still say physical attraction didn't matter? She couldn't answer. That silence hurt more than anything she'd already admitted. That night, I slept in the guest room. Not because she asked me to. Because I suddenly felt like an unwanted guest inside my own marriage. The next morning, I made a decision. I stopped acting like her husband. Not out of anger, out of self-respect. I stopped asking whether she'd slept well. Stopped bringing home her favorite coffee. Stopped planning date nights. Stopped texting her during lunch. Stopped waiting for dinner together. Stopped trying to initiate conversations that always ended with me carrying the emotional weight. I remained polite, respectful, helpful, but emotionally, I stepped back. If she wanted a best friend instead of a husband, that's exactly what I became. Nothing more. At first, she didn't even notice. Or maybe she enjoyed the extra space. For several weeks, life continued normally. I cooked my own meals. Did my laundry. And focused on work. And started going back to the gym. Reconnected with friends I'd barely seen in years. Even signed up for photography classes I'd always postponed because weekends had been reserved for couple time. And, ironically, and the less attention I gave Claire, the better my own life started becoming. Coworkers commented that I seemed happier. And my sister said I sounded lighter over the phone. And for the first time in years, Nee wasn't spending every waking moment trying to earn affection from someone who had already admitted she didn't want to give it. About 2 months later, and Claire finally noticed. And she asked why I never waited for her after work anymore. And why I wasn't asking her to watch movies. And why I stopped inviting her to dinner. Nee calmly reminded her of our conversation. And then she said she only meant the romantic part had faded. And then she never expected our friendship to change too. Nee quietly explained something she'd apparently never considered. And friendship isn't maintained. By one person doing all the work either.nen, she looked genuinely confused.nas, though she'd expected me to continue being the same devoted husband. Without actually being treated like one. I thought that conversation would finally make everything clear. Instead, it was only the beginning. Claire didn't react immediately. For a few days, she simply watched me. She noticed I no longer asked if she wanted coffee when I made my own. No longer waited for her before eating dinner. If she came home late, I had already cleaned the kitchen and gone upstairs. If she wanted to tell me about work, I listened politely. And then I returned to whatever I had been doing. No arguments. No resentment. No pleading. And just distance. None. Saturday morning, she walked into the living room and looked surprised to find me packing a camera bag. And then she asked where I was going. Ni explained that my photography group was taking a day trip to a nearby nature reserve. In she frowned. And weekends had always belonged to us. Except we hadn't actually spent a meaningful weekend together in over a year. She reminded me we'd talked about watching a movie. I gently corrected her. She had mentioned wanting to watch one sometime. We had never made plans. For the first time, she looked disappointed. When I returned that evening, she was sitting alone on the couch. The untouched popcorn bowl on the coffee table told me she'd been waiting. I apologized for the misunderstanding. Then I went upstairs. A few days later, something even stranger happened. She started texting me during work. Simple messages. Asking how my day was. Sending funny videos. Pictures of our dog sleeping. For years I had sent those kinds of messages. Most of mine had been answered with one-word replies. Now the roles had quietly reversed. I always responded. Politely. Hours later. Never rudely. Just. Without urgency. One evening she asked if we could have dinner together at our favorite Italian restaurant. I checked my calendar. I already had plans with friends from the photography club. She stared at me. She asked if I could cancel. I smiled apologetically. I told her I'd already committed. Years earlier, I would have canceled without hesitation. This time, I didn't. When I came home, she was still awake. She quietly admitted the house felt lonely lately. I understood exactly what she meant. I'd been feeling that same loneliness for years. The only difference was that now she was experiencing it too. Over the following month, she became increasingly anxious. She started waiting up for me, asking about my weekends, wondering who I'd met. Then one evening she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. She wanted to know if there was another woman. I honestly laughed. Not because it was ridiculous. Because it was ironic. There wasn't. I hadn't even gone on a single date. Everything she was reacting to was simply the absence of my constant attention. I calmly told her the truth. There was no one else. She didn't look relieved. She looked confused. As if she couldn't understand why I was changing if another woman wasn't responsible. That's when I realized something important. She believed my affection existed automatically. Like electricity. Always available the moment she flipped the switch. She had never considered what would happen if I simply stopped supplying it. Around that time, I received unexpected attention at work. A new project manager named Sophie joined our department. She was friendly with everyone, nothing inappropriate. We occasionally ate lunch with several coworkers. That was it. Unfortunately, Claire noticed Sophie's name appearing in casual conversations. One Friday evening, she asked whether Sophie was attractive. I answered honestly. She was. Claire immediately became quiet. The next morning she unexpectedly suggested we start having weekly date nights again. She wanted weekend trips. Cooking together. Movie marathons. Everything I'd spent years proposing. I asked what had changed. She said she'd realized she'd been taking me for granted. I appreciated the honesty. But something still bothered me. I asked whether these changes would have happened if I had continued chasing her the way I always had. She couldn't answer. Instead, tears filled her eyes. That night she climbed into the guest room doorway while I was reading. She admitted she missed me. Not just my help around the house, me. She missed talking, laughing, feeling close. She said the distance between us scared her. I quietly reminded her that this distance hadn't appeared overnight. It had taken years to build. I had simply stopped pretending it wasn't there. Over the next several weeks, Claire tried harder than I had ever seen. She planned vacations, bought concert tickets, cooked my favorite meals, even initiated physical affection for the first time in nearly 2 years. But every hug felt different now. Not because I hated her. Because I couldn't stop remembering that sentence. I feel disgusted after we sleep together. Once words like that enter a marriage, they don't disappear because someone changes their mind. They settle into places that are very difficult to reach. One evening, while we were folding laundry together, Claire finally broke down. She admitted she'd been terrified ever since I'd stopped pursuing her. She confessed that she'd always believed I would keep fighting for us, no matter how distant she became. She never imagined I would eventually accept her decision, and emotionally let go. Then she whispered something I never expected to hear. She said she felt like she was the one being friend-zoned now. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Because we both understood the truth. She hadn't lost me to another woman. She had lost me to the version of myself that finally realized love cannot survive when only one person is asked to keep proving it exists. And for the first time since our marriage began falling apart, she was the one desperately trying to earn back someone else's affection. The next morning, Claire called in sick to work. That alone was unusual. In 12 years together, she'd gone to the office through migraines, food poisoning, even with a sprained ankle. Now she was sitting at our kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When I came downstairs, she looked up as if she'd been waiting for hours. She asked if we could talk. I agreed. For the next hour, she admitted things she'd never said out loud. She confessed that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing me as someone she needed to impress. I had become permanent, predictable, safe. She assumed I'd always be there. Every romantic gesture I made became expected instead of appreciated. Every compromise became normal. Every sacrifice became invisible. She said she hadn't realized how much emotional work I'd been carrying until I quietly stopped doing it. I listened without interrupting. Years earlier, hearing those words would have filled me with hope. Now, they mostly made me sad, because awareness had arrived years too late. That evening she suggested couples therapy again. This time, I agreed. Not because I believed it would save the marriage, because I wanted to know whether it could honestly be saved. Our therapist asked us both the same question during the first session. When did you each stop feeling emotionally safe? Claire answered first. She said she stopped feeling safe after realizing I no longer needed her. Then it was my turn. I quietly explained that I stopped feeling safe the day my wife admitted intimacy with me made her feel disgusted. The therapist looked at Claire, then asked a simple question. Did you ever apologize for saying that? Claire's face went pale. She hadn't. She'd cried. She'd explained. She'd justified. But she'd never actually apologized. Right there in the therapist's office, she finally did. It sounded sincere. I believed she meant every word. The problem wasn't sincerity. The problem was memory. An apology can heal a wound. It can't erase a scar. Over the following months, Claire tried harder than she ever had during our entire marriage. She left little notes in my lunch, planned weekend trips, suggested we recreate our first date. She even surprised me with tickets to a concert by my favorite band. Every gesture was thoughtful. Every effort was genuine. Ironically, she had become the wife I'd spent years hoping for. But something inside me had already changed. I appreciated every effort. I simply couldn't feel what I used to. One afternoon, my younger sister invited me over for dinner. After everyone else went inside, she stopped me on the porch. She asked one question. Are you staying because you love her? Or because you feel guilty about leaving? I didn't answer. Because I honestly didn't know. That question stayed in my head for weeks. Around the same time, Sophie from work announced she was transferring to another office in another state. And Claire looked visibly relieved when I mentioned it. That reaction told me something important. She still believed another woman was the real threat. She never understood that Sophie had never mattered. The real threat had been emotional neglect. Months before Sophie ever arrived, I'd already started disappearing inside my own marriage. One evening, after another therapy session, our counselor asked Claire to leave the room for a few minutes. And she wanted to speak with me alone. She asked how I felt whenever Claire now hugged me. I searched for the right words. Finally, I admitted the truth. It felt like someone trying to rebuild a house. After watching it burn down. The structure looked familiar. The effort was real. I couldn't stop remembering the fire. When Claire returned, The therapist asked whether she understood that rebuilding trust isn't only about changing behavior. It's also about accepting that the other person may never feel the same again. And Claire quietly nodded. Then she started crying. Not because she felt sorry for herself. And because for the first time, and she realized she wasn't fighting against my anger. And she was fighting against my acceptance. And acceptance is much harder to reverse. A week later, she handed me a small photo album. Inside were pictures from every year of our relationship. Our first apartment. And road trips. And Christmas mornings. And the day we bought our house. And on the final page, she'd written a single sentence. And I spent years believing love couldn't disappear overnight. Now I know it disappears one unanswered need at a time. I closed the album. And looked at her. And then quietly admitted something I'd been avoiding for months. Ni had already forgiven her. Ni wasn't angry anymore. Ni didn't hate her. Ni didn't want revenge. But forgiveness and love aren't the same thing. And sometimes you can completely forgive someone and still realize you're no longer the right people for each other. The moment those words left my mouth, Claire's shoulders dropped. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Because she finally understood what I'd been trying to explain without saying it. She hadn't lost me the day I became cold. She lost me the day she convinced herself that a husband could survive indefinitely on friendship alone while being told that the deepest form of intimacy between them inspired disgust. Everything after that was simply both of us arriving at the truth from opposite directions. The following weekend, Claire asked if we could drive to the lake where we'd had our first date. For years, I would have said yes without thinking. This time, I checked my calendar first. I already had plans, not a date, not anything exciting. I had promised my father I would help him rebuild the deck behind his house. Claire quietly asked if I could postpone it. I apologized and told her I couldn't. She nodded. But I could see the disappointment on her face. It struck me how familiar the situation felt. For years, I had been the one asking for a little time together. Now our positions had completely reversed. That evening she admitted something I never expected. She said she finally understood how lonely I must have felt all those years. Not because I explained it, because she was living it herself. Waiting for someone else's attention. Wondering whether they still chose you. Trying to reconnect while feeling them slowly slip away. She said it was exhausting. I quietly told her it had been. For a very long time. Over the next month, our therapist suggested an unusual exercise. For 2 weeks, neither of us was allowed to discuss the future of the marriage. No conversations about divorce, no promises to stay together, no emotional negotiations. We were simply supposed to observe how we naturally treated each other, without pressure, without desperation. Interestingly, those became the calmest 2 weeks we'd had in years. We laughed more, cooked dinner together, walked the dog in the evenings. There were no arguments, no tension, no tears. From the outside, we probably looked like a happy couple again. Then the therapist asked us another difficult question. If there were no history between you, if you met each other for the very first time today, would you choose this relationship? Claire answered immediately. Yes. She said she finally understood what she almost lost. Then everyone looked at me. I couldn't answer. Not because I wanted to hurt her. Because I genuinely didn't know. The silence lasted almost a full minute. The therapist finally nodded. She said uncertainty is sometimes an answer by itself. That night Claire didn't cry. She simply sat beside me on the back porch watching the sunset. After a long time, she quietly admitted something. She said she'd spent months trying to make me love her again. Only recently had she realized she should have spent those years making me feel loved in the first place. There wasn't a single sentence I could disagree with. Around that time, my company offered me a promotion. The position came with a significant raise. There was only one condition. I'd have to relocate to another city about 4 hours away. A year earlier, I would have rejected it instantly because Claire's career was established where we lived. Now, I found myself seriously considering it. When I told Claire about the opportunity, she surprised me. She smiled. Then she encouraged me to accept it. She said she never wanted to become the reason I turned down another dream. Her response was kind, selfless, exactly what I'd wanted from a partner for years. Ironically, receiving that support made the decision even harder. A few days later, I met with the therapist alone. She asked one final question. What would staying accomplish that leaving cannot? I thought for a long time. Eventually I admitted the truth. Staying would honor our history. Leaving might honor who we'd both become. Those aren't always the same thing. When I returned home, Claire was sitting in the living room holding our wedding album. She wasn't crying. She simply asked whether I'd made my decision. I sat beside her, took a deep breath. Then I told her I was accepting the promotion. I also told her I didn't think we should move as husband and wife. The words hurt more to say than I expected. Claire closed the wedding album. She rested her hand on top of it for several seconds. Then she quietly nodded. She admitted she'd known that answer was coming long before I said it. What surprised her wasn't my decision. It was that I had stayed long enough to make sure it wasn't made out of anger. She reached over and squeezed my hand. For the first time in months, neither of us was trying to convince the other of anything. We were simply accepting reality. She whispered that she was sorry she had waited until losing me to become the partner I deserved. I told her something I'd come to believe. She hadn't become a better partner because she was losing me. She had become a better person because she had finally been honest with herself. Those are two very different things. A week later, we filed for divorce together. No accusations, no fighting over possessions, no courtroom drama. Just two signatures ending a marriage that neither hatred nor betrayal had destroyed. Instead, it had slowly faded under years of emotional neglect, until one brutally honest sentence exposed what had already been true for a long time. And as I packed the last box into my car before leaving for my new city, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't driving away from Claire. I was finally driving toward a version of myself that no longer begged to be loved. The divorce process took 5 months. Friends kept asking whose fault it was. Some assumed Claire had cheated. Others assumed I had. The truth disappointed people. There wasn't a secret affair. There wasn't a hidden family. There wasn't some explosive scandal waiting to be uncovered. Our marriage died because one person slowly stopped investing, and the other eventually stopped believing it could be saved. People don't like stories like that. They're harder to simplify. I accepted the promotion and moved into a small apartment overlooking a river. It wasn't luxurious. But for the first time in years, the silence in my home felt peaceful instead of lonely. I started hiking on weekends, joined another photography club, made friends without feeling guilty for spending time away from home. Little by little, I rediscovered hobbies I'd quietly abandoned during the years I spent trying to rescue a relationship by myself. Claire and I only communicated through email during the divorce. Mostly about paperwork, utilities, selling the house. There were no emotional messages, no late-night phone calls, no attempts to undo the decision. It felt strangely respectful. Then something unexpected happened. About 3 months after I moved away, Claire sent me an email with no subject line. Inside was a single photograph. It was the bench where we'd had our first date. Under the picture, she wrote only one sentence. I walked past it today and realized I spent years expecting you to keep bringing flowers to a garden I had stopped watering. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I closed the email. I never replied. Not because it wasn't meaningful, because she didn't ask for an answer. Sometimes people finally understand after it's too late. That understanding still matters. It just doesn't always change the ending. About a year after the divorce became official, I attended a former coworker's wedding. I almost didn't go. Large social events had become exhausting. But he had helped me through some of my worst days, so I wanted to be there. During the reception, I ran into Sophie again. She had transferred back to our city after her project ended. We laughed about how everyone at work had once assumed we were secretly dating. Neither of us had realized those rumors existed. We spent most of the evening talking about travel, photography, and work. Nothing flirtatious. Just two adults having an easy conversation. At the end of the night, she asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime. I surprised myself by saying yes. Not because I desperately wanted another relationship. Because for the first time, I wasn't afraid of one. Dating Sophie was completely different from anything I'd experienced before. There were no games. If she missed me, she said so. If I needed space after a stressful week, she respected it. If one of us felt hurt, we talked about it before resentment had a chance to grow. The biggest surprise came 6 months into the relationship. One evening she looked at me and asked why I always seemed shocked whenever she complimented me. I laughed awkwardly. Then realized she was right. I'd become so accustomed to feeling merely tolerated that genuine affection almost felt suspicious. Healing wasn't only about leaving an unhealthy marriage. It was about relearning what healthy love actually felt like. Nearly 2 years after the divorce, Claire reached out one final time. She wasn't asking to reconcile. She wasn't lonely. She simply wanted to return a box she'd found while cleaning the attic. Inside were old letters I'd written during our first year together. Movie ticket stubs, postcards, photographs. At the bottom sat the very first birthday card I'd ever given her. Across the envelope she'd written one note. I should have appreciated this man while I still had the chance. That sentence hurt. Not because I wanted her back. Because I believed she truly meant it. I hoped she eventually found happiness. I genuinely did. Just not with me. Years later, I heard through mutual friends that Claire had remarried. Apparently, one of the first conversations she had with her new partner was about emotional intimacy. And she openly admitted how her previous marriage had ended. And she promised herself she would never again allow appreciation to become assumption. And when I heard that, and I smiled. Not because I regretted leaving. And because pain only has meaning if someone learns from it. And around the same time, Sophie and I became engaged. One evening, while unpacking boxes in our new house, I found the old wedding album from my marriage to Claire. And for a few seconds, I considered throwing it away. And instead, I placed it back in the box. And that album wasn't evidence of failure. Net was evidence of growth. And every mistake inside those photographs had shaped the man I eventually became. And looking back, people often ask me what finally changed. And they assume it was becoming cold. And ignoring my wife. And withdrawing emotionally. And it wasn't. And those were only symptoms. And real turning point happened the moment I accepted a painful truth. You cannot negotiate someone into desiring you. You cannot guilt someone into appreciating you. And you cannot spend years proving your worth to someone who has already stopped looking for it. Ironically, becoming emotionally distant didn't make Claire love me again. It simply forced both of us to confront what had been hidden beneath years of routine. And she discovered that stability isn't something to take for granted. And discovered that self-respect sometimes looks like quietly walking away instead of endlessly trying to convince someone to choose you. And people often describe this story as the one where my wife lost it after I became cold. I don't think that's entirely accurate. She didn't lose her mind. She lost the certainty that I would always remain exactly where she left me. And once that certainty disappeared, and she finally saw me the way she should have all along. And not as a permanent fixture in her life. And but as a person whose heart could eventually grow tired of waiting. That's the lesson I carry with me now. Love isn't sustained by grand gestures. It's sustained by making the other person feel valued before they have to wonder whether they ever were. Because by the time someone quietly stops chasing your affection, the relationship is often much closer to the end than either of you realizes. 3 years later, I hardly ever thought about the day Claire told me she felt disgusted. Not because I had forgotten it. Because it no longer controlled me. Time has a strange way of changing painful memories. At first, they feel like open wounds. Later, they become scars. Eventually, they become reminders of how much you've healed. Sophie and I built a life that felt almost unfamiliar in the best possible way. If one of us felt ignored, we talked about it. If work became overwhelming, we checked in instead of drifting apart. There were no silent competitions over who cared more, no guessing games, no emotional starvation disguised as maturity. One evening, while making dinner together, Sophie accidentally burned the pasta. She laughed so hard she had tears in her eyes. Then she ordered pizza instead. Watching her laugh over such a tiny mistake made me realize something. In my previous marriage, small problems had often become evidence that something bigger was wrong. Now, they were simply small problems. That difference changed everything. About 4 years after the divorce, I received an invitation from a mutual friend. Claire was getting married again. I wasn't invited to the ceremony itself. Only to a large reunion dinner several weeks afterward where many old friends would be present. I debated whether to go. Sophie encouraged me. She said running from the past only gives it power. So we went. I hadn't seen Claire in years. She looked different. Not physically, peacefully. She introduced me to her husband. He seemed kind, quiet, confident enough that he didn't feel threatened by my presence. Claire introduced Sophie warmly. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. No awkwardness, no hidden resentment. Just 4 adults whose lives had taken different paths. As we were leaving, Claire quietly stopped me. She asked if she could say one last thing. I nodded. She admitted she'd spent years believing that love faded naturally in every marriage. She thought passion always disappeared. She assumed companionship was all anyone could realistically expect. Then she met someone who challenged that belief. Not because he was more attractive. Not because he was more exciting. Because she had finally learned that emotional intimacy has to be maintained before it starts disappearing. She smiled sadly. Then thanked me. Not for staying. Not for leaving. But for refusing to live the rest of your life, pretending that friendship alone was enough when your heart needed something deeper. I wished her happiness. And I meant it. As Sophie and I walked back to the car, she slipped her hand into mine. She asked if I was okay. I smiled. Then admitted something I'd never fully understood until that moment. Years ago, I thought the worst thing Claire had taken from me was my confidence. It wasn't. The worst thing she'd almost convinced me of was that asking to feel loved was somehow asking for too much. That belief had nearly followed me into every future relationship. Thankfully, it didn't. A year later, Sophie and I welcomed our first child. Holding my son in my arms, I found myself thinking about the kind of marriage I wanted him to grow up watching. Not a perfect one. Those don't exist. I wanted him to see two people who chose each other intentionally. Who apologized without keeping score. Who made each other feel wanted instead of merely tolerated. Because children don't learn what love is from wedding photos. They learn it from ordinary Tuesday evenings. From how their parents greet each other after work. From whether affection feels natural or forced. From whether kindness survives disagreements. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes in the garage, I found the notebook I'd kept during the final year of my marriage to Claire. Every page was filled with questions. How do I make her love me again? What am I doing wrong? How can I fix this? I smiled sadly. Then I closed the notebook. If I could answer that version of myself today, I'd only need one sentence. You are trying to solve a problem that belongs to two people by carrying it alone. No marriage survives that forever. Looking back now, people sometimes ask what happened after I became cold toward my wife. They imagine that being distant somehow made her realize my value. That's only half the truth. What really happened was that I stopped abandoning myself in order to keep someone else comfortable. Once I respected my own needs, everything else became clear. Claire finally understood what she'd lost. I finally understood what I deserved. Neither of those realizations came in time to save our marriage. But together, they gave both of us the chance to build healthier lives afterward. If this story has a villain, it isn't Claire. It isn't me. It's complacency. It's the quiet belief that someone who loves you today will still be there tomorrow, no matter how little you nurture the relationship. Love rarely disappears all at once. It fades through neglected conversations, unreturned affection, unspoken gratitude, and the dangerous assumption that the other person will always keep trying, even after you've stopped. In the end, I didn't leave because my wife stopped desiring me. I left because she expected me to keep giving husband-level love while accepting friend-level affection in return. No relationship can survive that imbalance forever. The greatest lesson I carried away wasn't about romance. It was about self-worth. Never stay in a relationship where you're expected to endlessly prove your value while the other person no longer feels obligated to show you theirs. The right partner won't make you wonder whether you're wanted. They'll make sure you never have to ask. And that's how this chapter of my life truly ended. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with something far more valuable. The quiet certainty that love should never require you to beg for a place in someone else's heart.